Hello and welcome back. Today is Cuddle Up Sampler first block tutorial day. I'm excited to start sewing this block along with you today. I think we're going to have so much fun. If you're new to the Cuddle Up Sampler sew along, I will have the playlist of the videos that I've shared previously about this sew along. And if you are here anxiously awaiting for this tutorial, we are just going to dive right in. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to make the tree block in the Cuddle Up Sampler. Just a reminder, you will need a copy of the Cuddle Up Sampler book to participate in this sew along. I will be going over how to piece it, but I will not be giving the measurements as we go along. That information is included in the Cuddle Up Sampler book. So you definitely need that to know what pieces to cut and then the sizes of your units as we are going along. But Christmas tree block is what is on the agenda for today. Let's dive in. I have all of my pieces cut and labeled here in front of me. If you watch the Cuddle Up Sampler cutting video, you know that I have pre-cut all of my fabrics. That is an option for this sampler. You could also opt to just cut the pieces that you need from block release day to block release day. The pattern is set up to work both ways. Whichever way you are choosing to piece, grab your pieces. You're going to need A through O, and in your pattern you're going to see everything listed here. You can also reference the diagram to the right of those cutting instructions so that you know which print each lettered piece goes with. And we are just going to start right here with step 1. This begins on page 5. The first thing that we need to do is draw a diagonal line across the back of 2 J squares. These are our J squares up here, and I am going to go ahead and do that. I was asked which print I am using for my background print. This is the white on white print from Starberry. It's the same print as this green and this black, that little hand-drawn sketchy floral. And that is what the pattern calls for. So I am using the same thing. If you are using something a little bit different for your background fabrics, a Motabella Solid in the color 200 works great, or any of the white on whites from Coriander Seeds will work great as well. I'll tell you, it is much slipperier on a table than it is on a cutting mat. I'm opting not to use a cutting mat to mark these, and I'm kind of wishing I had, because I did not realize how much that helps keep your squares in place. So I am just marking that diagonal line on the back of those 2 squares. And then we are going to be placing those right side together with an A rectangle. You'll see that it references use the stitch and flip method. That is actually illustrated on page 4. So if you wonder what that means, what is the stitch and flip method, you can reference those illustrations and instructions. It is also called snowball corners, sew and flip, easy corner triangles. Any of those sewing terms refer to this same technique. I always call it stitch and flip in my patterns, and you'll see that in other patterns as well. So we are going to first put J on this left corner of our A rectangle. Let me slide this up here. When you are doing sew and flip corners, you do need to make sure that your diagonal is oriented just like it shows in the pattern. So the first thing to do here is to place right sides together, and then we are going to sew on that marked diagonal, and then take this top square, press it away from the center, and you're going to want to make sure that all of your perimeter edges are even. We don't want any overhang. We don't want anything like this after we've sewn it. We just want it to line up perfectly with our bottom rectangle. And by pressing before we trim out anything, we are able to make sure that everything lines up just like we want it to before we trim those bottom 2 layers away. I will do my left side first, and then once you have pressed, double checked for accuracy, you'll trim out those bottom 2 layers, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you will go ahead and add your other side in the same manner. I will do that, and then I want to show you what that looks like once everything is trimmed, for those of you maybe unfamiliar with this method of making flying geese units. I came back just a little bit quicker than I said I was going to because I realized some of you may be new to my method of these stitch and flip corners and be a little bit confused about the information that I was sharing. So I wanted to show you this exactly. I've sewn this top square on that marked diagonal and I've pressed it out. So this is what I was talking about, where you want to make sure that your perimeter right here is exactly even on the front and then also on the back. Make sure that everything is nice and tidy. You want this unit, after these corners are sewn on, to be the same measurement as your original bottom rectangle was. And you can see that information listed in your pattern. As you are working your way through, it will tell you what your unit should measure. But you're going to find that this measurement here of this piece will be the same after you sew these on. So once you have sewn your square onto that corner, double checked for accuracy, then you can go ahead and trim out your bottom 2 layers. You can do this with a rotary cutter, and I probably would choose to use a rotary cutter right here, but since I don't have my mat set up, I am just going to cut this with a scissors. You're leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to have those 2 pieces left over right there. And then you are ready to add your other corner, and you're going to do that the same way. So on the diagonal, press out, trim out those bottom 2 layers. If you make flying geese units and you find that you tend to be a little bit short, your top square doesn't quite meet the perimeter of your bottom piece, you can sew just a thread's width away from the marked diagonal to the outside of the block. And that is going to give you just a little bit more room when you press this out. So if that's a problem that you encounter, that is one way that you can fix that problem. So I will go ahead and sew on that diagonal, repeat everything I just shared with you. Here's what your unit looks like now. I have not trimmed out my bottom 2 layers because I did another little trick that we can do in quilt making that I wanted to share with you. This is not included in the pattern, but it is something that you can always do with these stitch and flip units. You might have seen me trim these off and thought, I don't like having all of that waste. So if that is you, here's something that you can do. So I sewed my first diagonal line here, and then I marked another 1/2 inch line. So a line 1/2 inch away from my original sewing line. And now when I cut between these, again, I would prefer to use a rotary cutter and ruler. When I cut between these, I'm going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both of these units. Essentially, what I am doing is making a 1/2 square triangle at the same time that I can use in another project. So we have our completed flying geese unit here. You'll see the measurement that it should measure in step 1. And then we've got this little unit that we've created because we added that extra line. So anytime you are working through this pattern, if you see a stitch and flip corner and you want to utilize that technique, you can. I tend to do it more on larger pieces than on smaller pieces, just because I don't find myself in need of lots of little 1/2 square triangles. But you can certainly use it if you love piecing those little small blocks. This is a great way to just get yourself a 1/2 square triangle that you can use in an upcoming project of your choosing. That is a tip for those. And now we are ready to move on to step 2. We are going to be sewing our K rectangles to both sides of our flying geese unit. You're going to notice K is slightly longer in one direction than the other direction, so make sure that you are lining everything up nicely here. We're going to sew these right sides together, and throughout the Cuddle Up Sampler pattern, you will be following the arrows for your pressing instructions. So you can see that we're pressing out right here, and for our flying geese, those were also pressed out. I'm going to sew that. At the same time, I am going to sew together my step 3 units. So you can see we have B and we have C, which are these 2 units right here, and we are sewing those 2 together. So I will do all of that at the same time. We've added the K rectangles, and this completes unit 1, which you see here in step 2. And then you can see what that will need to measure. And then we've also completed step 3 by sewing B and C together. The next thing that we need to do is add L corners to both sides of this unit right here. We're going to use that same stitch and flip method that I showed you how to do earlier, and I have already marked my lines. Now for this step, you will want to make sure that you have your check on top and your star fabric on the bottom, just like it shows here. If you reverse that, you will just have your fabrics reversed in this chunk. So not a deal breaker, but if you follow the diagrams for the fabric placement, then you're going to be making it exactly as I made mine. So we're going to place these L squares. Sew on that marked diagonal here on both corners. Make sure that your diagonal is going this direction as I have placed here. Sew on those, press out, trim the bottom 2 layers just like we did moments ago. This is the completed unit that we made in step 4. The next thing that we need to do, well, let me flip that over. That's what the back looks like. And then the next thing that we are doing is adding M rectangles to both sides of this unit. So we're going to sew those on both sides. And then that is going to complete unit 2. I'm going to sew those, but at the same time, I'm going to grab the pieces that I need for the next step. So starting in step 6, we are going to be making an Ohio star block. To begin making that, you are going to need G squares and D squares. And the first thing that you'll want to do is draw a diagonal line across the back of your G squares, which I have done. We're going to be pairing those with our D squares. So to begin, we will place these 2 squares right sides together. And you can see here in step 6, we are going to be sewing 1/4 inch away from both sides of our marked diagonal. And then we are going to cut apart on that marked diagonal. And then we are going to press to the green fabric. At this point in piecing, we do not need to worry about trimming these to a specific size. After sewing those M rectangles, you will have completed unit 2, and you can see in step 5 what this unit now measures. And then here's where we're at with our half square triangles. I wanted to show you what it will look like once you have sewn on either side of that marked diagonal, but has not yet been cut apart. So you'll have sewing lines, and you can see how these are going to turn into half square triangles. And I did that with my other set. I cut apart on the marked diagonal, and then I pressed to the green fabric. So this is what they're going to look like now, untrimmed. We don't need to worry about trimming just yet. Our next step is going to happen here in step number 7. We are going to basically be repeating what we just did. So we need to mark a diagonal line on one of our squares. Let me see. Yes, here I've marked it on here. So we have a diagonal line from corner to corner marked on the back of one of our half square triangle units. And we are going to place this right sides together with one of the other half square triangle units. We'll do the same thing once we cut these apart. Place them right sides together. And we are again going to be sewing 1/4 inch away from both sides of that marked diagonal. And then we will trim those apart, and that is going to give us these little 1/4 square triangles or hourglass units. That's our next step to take care of. This is what our 1/4 square triangles will look like now. I did the same thing that I did with the half square triangles to show you these steps. So on this pair right here, I have the marked diagonal. I've sewn on both sides of that marked diagonal. And then you can see how these are going to look once we cut them apart on the diagonal. And that's what we have here. These are both pressed just to one side. You will see those illustrations here in step 7, just pressing those to one side. I have not trimmed anything yet. The next step for me will be to go ahead and cut these apart, press these to one side, and then trim these to the measurements listed in step 8. I have a ruler that I love using, the June Taylor Perfect Half Square Triangle and 1/4 Square Triangle ruler. If you've been here, you know I love using this ruler. That's what I'm going to use to trim, but you do not need a specialty ruler to trim these down to size. The instructions in step 8 give you the center point of these 1/4 square triangles, so you know exactly how far it is from that center point to the outside edge, so you can trim everything around using that center point measurement. So I will go ahead and get everything trimmed down, and then we are going to be ready to assemble our Ohio star block. My quarter square triangles are all trimmed and ready to be sewn into the Ohio star block. Now, I did mention that June Taylor ruler. Some of you may not be familiar with that, so I am going to link to a video where I chatted about it. I think I can safely say it is my most used specialty ruler, and I primarily use it for quarter square triangles. You can also use it for half square triangles, but it's not one I reach for half square triangles, but always for quarter square triangles in this trimming step is where I find it to be so useful. So I will link to that in case you were curious about how that ruler works. I have laid out my quarter square triangles with my E squares in the four corners and an H square in the center. This is step number 10, where we are assembling our Ohio star block. Now you're going to see we're going to be assembling this in rows, and we are going to press away from our quarter square triangles in each row. Pay attention to where you have your white portions of your quarter square triangles. It's very easy to get one of these pivoted the wrong direction. So do note the placement of the whites within the block. Sew the block together in horizontal rows, and then you're going to sew the rows together to complete the Ohio star block. You can see your pressing instructions there. I will assemble this, but at the same time, I'm grabbing the pieces I need for the next step, which are N and F. You are going to see this here in step 11. We are making large half square triangles. I have already drawn my diagonal line on the back of my N square. We're going to be placing these right sides together and sewing 1/4 inch away from both sides of that marked diagonal. And then you are going to want to trim these half square triangles after you have sewn, cut apart on the marked diagonal, pressed to the green, and then you are going to be trimming to the size listed in step 11. I am going to go ahead and assemble those from start to finish. It's the same process that we did up here for making these smaller half square triangles, except we are going to go ahead and trim them to size right away. This is our completed Ohio star block and our 2 completed half square triangles that have been trimmed to the correct measurement. The next thing that we want to do, you can see in step 12, we are going to sew these 3 units together, and this will create unit 3. I will do that at the same time as I am creating unit 4, which is sewing O rectangles to either side of the I rectangle, and you see that in step 13. So we will be creating unit 3 and unit 4. All 4 units are now sewn together. The last step we need to take is just to sew those all together into one quilt block. And our tree block is complete. I've sewn all of those units together, which completes the block. This is what it looks like on the back. You can see all of the pressing. And then we'll take a look at the front. Step 14 in the pattern tells you what this block will measure once you've sewn everything together. If you have any questions about the piecing of this block, be sure to leave that in the comments below. And I thank you so much for watching. I'm looking forward to sewing the next block of the Cuddle Up Sampler together with you.